So the question, who is the oldest of the big three, seems like it should be a pretty straightforward answer, but as it turns out, it's actually not. Not by a long shot. It's actually so not straightforward that we were able to make an entire video out of it. So that's what we're going to dive into today. But we definitely want to hear what you all have to say down below, because once we start talking about all the children of the big three, this topic gets wild. Now, the whole problem with this question comes down to the definition of oldest and how we define what old actually means. Because if we're talking about a person's age in years based on how their body grows, then the answer would be Percy. He's the first child of the big three to turn 16, and canonically, he is now in college and still getting older, which means that if we're counting the physical age of his body, then Percy wins. But he hasn't lived for the longest. Talia was born before Percy and is still alive, but since she became immortal while joining the Hunters, she hasn't aged beyond a day before 16. When we refer to the gods, we have no problem calling them thousands of years old, because even though they stopped aging, they're still thousands of years old. We call Zoe Nightshade thousands of years old for the same reason, despite the fact that she doesn't age either. So does that make Talia the oldest, and what does that say about her time as a tree? Apollo says that she continued aging, just much more slowly, because remember, she was 12 when she seemingly died, and the Golden Fleece resurrected her 6 years later, which means she should have been in the neighborhood of 18 years old when she and Percy first met. Even though she was technically alive, she didn't experience the passage of time, so in the same breath, we could also claim that she had the life experiences of a 12-year-old, despite physically being 15 when she came out of hibernation. And we're just getting started. Because if we're going to go by who was born first, then neither of them have a claim to the title. In that case, Nico would seemingly swoop in and claim the title, because not only was he born first, but he experienced the most passages of time in the mortal realm. Whether Talia was 12, 15, or 18 when she woke up can be debated depending on the definitions that we use, but her life experience does play a factor. Nico was alive and well on Earth for well over 60 years in the Lotus Hotel, even though he didn't age and was effectively immortal in the same vein as Talia is now. He didn't realize how much time was passing, and he didn't mature in relation to the time spent in the Lotus Hotel. But are we counting it by this metric? And if we are, then where does Hazel fit in? First, is she technically a child of the big three? Because she's technically not a child of Hades, but she's a daughter of Pluto instead. We know that this is the same god, but we recently released a full video on how Camp Jupiter doesn't seem to know about the Great Prophecy. And as far as we can tell, they were not awaiting a child of the big three and are not anticipating them turning 16. This might be why Camp Jupiter simply wasn't aware of the prophecy, but it just is possible that the Roman gods wouldn't qualify as members of the big three for one reason or another. The reason why we bring up Hazel, however, is because she was born around the same time as Nico, and we actually don't technically know which of the two of them was born first. Though some evidence does suggest that Hazel was actually born first. We know that she died in 1941, and according to the son of Neptune, this was her 13th birthday. So we know that Hazel was born in 1928. And we know that Nico and Bianca were put into the Lotus Hotel because World War II was brewing, implying that this was right on the cusp of starting. The death of Mario D'Angelo sent Hades over the edge and was probably a key factor in the war breaking out. And since we know that World War II officially began on September of 1939, we can conclude that the death of Mario D'Angelo likely took place earlier in 1939. Nico, however, was 10 when he was put into hiding, which would mean that Nico was born in 1929, 1 year later than Hazel if this math is correct. But please understand that there is some room for error since a lot of this relies on deductive reasoning. In fact, please apply that sentiment to this entire video. So then this would mean that Hazel was born first, but as we mentioned a minute ago, she died. She did not fake her death, nor was she put into hiding like Nico or made immortal like Talia. She straight up died and went to Asphodel. As a daughter of Pluto, however, she was able to hold on to the memories of her past life, and even remembers her time in Asphodel. Which brings up the philosophical argument, if she was remembering her experiences and developing as a person, does that count as living? Her mortal body was no longer alive, but she was continuing to grow mentally and was still the same person. And this actually is why she became so adept at manipulating the mist. We have a full breakdown on this idea, but it basically boils down to the fact that she kept hearing the remorseful whispers of wayward souls, and she began to understand the properties of desire and nostalgia better than anyone else. But that's a lot to dive into right now. The reason we bring this up, however, is because this is our evidence that Hazel was learning in Asphodel, even if she didn't know it at the time. If anyone asks, she can tell you what her time in Asphodel was like, even though the years blurred together. So if she remembers it, then is it really different from the Lotus Casino? So now, that also means that before Bianca died, would she have counted as the eldest of the child of the big three during the events of the Titan's Curse, since she lived more years than Talia or Percy despite being physically younger? In fact, the only thing we can say with any degree of certainty is that by most metrics, Jason is the youngest. But that's about it, and even that's not set in stone. Physically, Nico and Hazel are younger than Jason because their bodies are not as old. And since he turned 16 in the Mark of Athena, that would also mean that Talia is physically younger than him as well. But when we tally the total numbers of years experienced, Jason keeps falling short, arguably only really beating out Hazel if we don't count her time in Asphodel as being alive. But again, that's a major philosophical can of worms that should really remain closed, even though we're not going to leave it alone. We started the script as a joke, and then it completely spiraled out of control, so this is what we're left with when all is said and done. Also, if we're talking about who was physically just born first, it would be Bianca. Because if Nico is technically a year older than Hazel, and Bianca was a few years older than Nico, Bianca would have been born before Hazel. This video isn't meant to have a surefire answer right now, because as we mentioned, it all depends on the definition of age and how we define aging, but as far as which of these is technically correct, we're going to let you decide for yourselves. We do want you to jump all down to the comments below and let us know what your thoughts are, because this is definitely one of our weirder videos, and we're sure we're still missing something. So here are the 3 main schools of thought that we came up with. If we count the total amount of aging the body has done, and we go by who is the oldest physical form, then the answer is Percy. If we're counting who was born first, then it would be Hazel. But if we're counting total years experienced, then the answer is probably Talia, depending on how you weigh Asphodel and the Lotus Casino. But I should probably go ahead and sign off before I have a migraine. As always, we love this series. We love talking about this series, even when it gives us headaches. And be sure to come visit us in the next one.